This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Somali security forces kill 5 Al-Shabaab fighters to end hotel siege. U.S. sanctions 5 over the death of South Sudanese activists. And we get you more reactions to Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's Nobel Peace Prize. This is CGTN. Welcome to Africa Live with me, Beatrice Marshall in Nairobi. Also coming up on the program. In business news, several mines grind to a halt as South Africa's power crisis worsens. And in your sport, a 4-time world champion Noor El Sherbini looking to reclaim the top spot in squash. We begin in Juba, where the U.S. has imposed sanctions on 5 South Sudanese individuals. The U.S. says they are responsible for the abduction and likely murder of 2 activists in 2017. Opposition member Aggrey Idri and human rights lawyer Dong Samuel were allegedly kidnapped from Nairobi, Kenya in January 2017. They were then illegally transported to the South Sudanese capital of Juba and subsequently killed on orders from the government. These allegations were revealed in a statement on Tuesday by the U.S. Treasury. It adds that the South Sudanese government has repeatedly used extrajudicial killings as a means to silence dissent, limit freedom of speech and the press, and enforce the political status quo. A United Nations panel earlier this year also concluded it was highly probable that the 2 men were executed. Well, let's cross over to Juba now. CGTN's Patrick Oyet is joining us live from Juba with the latest. Patrick, can you give us more details on these developments? What's the reaction from the government or from Riek Machar?
Yeah, the government here has actually, talked about sanction, but it has not given any details about this accusation that the 2, Samuel Dong and Idri Aggrey, have actually been killed. They have not come out openly to either state this clearly that these people have not been killed or they have been killed. They have not said this. But what they have said is that the sanctions does not help. They say sanctions at this time when they are actually in the process of implementing a peace deal does not help. At least the U.S. should have considered that let peace first come to the country and then later the issue of accountability could be actually brought in. But to the common people on the ground, some people are supporting this sanction. They are saying that this is to the security sectors, the people who are in the security sector. It is a form of a deterrent so that, they don't carry out extrajudicial killing. They start following the law and also upholding the rule of law. Yeah, on the peace process, of course, this afternoon, President Salva Kiir is scheduled to meet with opposition leader Riek Machar, who came to Juba from Khartoum on Tuesday to try to iron out the issues concerning the number of states so that they move forward the peace process. Yeah, so that is basically what is happening as far as these sanctions is concerned.
Well, there is, of course, the question of the impact that the sanctions would have on the peace process. So how influential are those officials that have been banned, though? Are they capable of scuttling the peace process?
Yeah, the problem in South Sudan is that the security sector is the biggest challenge, and that's why some people say that even though the current peace deal is not moving well, the fact that the guns have gone silent is a big credit, and that is where the problem is. Because if, according to the government, if at all these security officers, some are general in the national security, in the military and so forth, when you sanction them, then they may become so stubborn and become so difficult to control when it comes to this time of implementing the peace deal. Remember, there are still some armed groups that are opposed to the current peace deal. They may actually maybe go and join them and complicate the whole process. The fact that they know that they are sanctioned, they are, they don't have the freedom and so on, they may complicate the whole process. So that is the worry here. But otherwise, some people say this is something that is going to tell the leaders of South Sudan and those in the security sector that they have to follow the rule of law. If somebody is arrested, you have to follow the procedures and make sure that, you know, the right things are done. If there are cases against such a person, take the person to court. But also, I think it sends a message to the region, because if these people were kidnapped from a country like Kenya, then Kenya also might be also, you know, having some questions that it should answer. How did they get kidnapped and how did they get out of that territory? Did they have knowledge and so forth? So lots of things still to be looked at in regard to this case, which is ongoing. And of course, looking at these people, these were people that are known in South Sudan. They were, for example, somebody like Samuel Dong is a renowned lawyer. He contributed in the writing of the current interim constitution, which is in the country. Thank you.
Patrick Oyet joining us there from Juba with that update. Thank you. In Somalia, security forces say they have killed 5 Al-Shabaab gunmen during a hotel siege. 3 civilians and 2 soldiers also died during the attack. The militant group confirmed that it had launched the assault on the Sahel Hotel late evening on Tuesday. The hit took place near the presidential residence in the capital, Mogadishu. Authorities say dozens of people were rescued from the scene. 11 other people were reported injured, including 9 civilians and 2 soldiers. The group had also attacked the hotel in 2016. Al-Shabaab in Somalia is known for frequent bombings and raids in the bid to topple the United Nations-backed government. Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed marked a historic moment when he received his Nobel Peace Prize. The Ethiopian leader has spearheaded ambitious reforms. In his 18 months as Prime Minister, he put an end to the decades-long hostilities between Ethiopia and Eritrea. The African Union's chairperson, Musa Faki Mahamat, is among the leaders congratulating him. CGTN's Girum Chala has more on the African Union's response.
His efforts of striking peace with a neighboring Eritrea, which has ended the 2 decades of stalemate, has made Abiy Ahmed the winner of the 2019 Peace Prize. The African Union said this is a reason to celebrate.
Not only was it a stupendous show of political courage, but also proof that all you need is political courage and the political will of one person to be able to make peace. And at this point in time on the African continent, we're certainly glad that the Nobel Peace Prize committee was able to recognize African leadership as a symbol of what global leadership should look like.
The AU also says Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's recognition by the Norway-based Nobel Committee has global symbolism and displays an African pride.
The win of Dr. Abiy Ahmed as a new leader, he hadn't been in power for more than 2 years, to have demonstrated such immense political courage at almost the very beginning of his leadership as Prime Minister of Ethiopia, not only for his own country, but also to make peace in a very restive region, which is the Horn of Africa region, but which reverberated across the continent. And that show of political courage and leadership was recognized globally by the Nobel Peace Prize. Well, of course, it's a matter of continental pride for all of us.
The continent of Africa now has challenging tasks it's undertaking to see a lasting peace across its members' borders. Abiy's winner is one important addition to push for the success of, for instance, the plan of silencing the guns by 2020.
Aims and goals like silencing the guns by 2020 may seem like an insurmountable and certainly for some an impossible goal, but the example that has been shown by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed certainly makes short thrift of that.
Now, many expect Abiy Ahmed to live up to his promises and deliver more for his country, the Eastern Africa region and the continent at large. Well, also contribute for the global peace too, including the much expected general elections in the country. Several challenges are ahead of his leadership. The hope is he will continue with his deliveries. Grum Chala, CGTN, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
Let's now cross live to Addis Ababa. Obang Metho, the founder and executive director of Solidarity Movement for a New Ethiopia, is joining us from Ethiopia's capital. Thank you very much for joining us here on Africa Live, Obang Metho. A major milestone, though, for Ethiopia's leader, Abiy Ahmed. What is the significance of this recognition? Is there a sense, perhaps, that it will boost Abiy Ahmed's reform efforts?
Thank you so much for this opportunity. Yes, it's very significant for Prime Minister Abiy and for Ethiopia as well. Usually Ethiopian has been known for, wars, known for the starvation, not for many, many negative things, but to win the Nobel Peace Prize, definite for the Prime Minister, is really significant. As you put it, it's not really for what he has done in Ethiopia, but for what he has done with Eritrea. So it's a significant for the relationship between Ethiopia and Eritrea. But within Ethiopia, he has a lot of work to do. But definite, this is for Ethiopian, it is a good thing to celebrate, and for Ethiopian young people to believe in themselves that they can be anybody and they can do anything in this world. So, and also that it gave the image of Ethiopia, something positive to look up to. So it's definitely significant in that case in terms of what was done in Ethiopia, what was done for the outside. But within the country, I think that we will take it as this is a down payment for the Prime Minister. So as the election is coming forward, as lots of Ethiopians are looking for a real meaningful reform, not just reform, constitutional reform and institutional reform. Until that is done, I think this is a down payment for the change to come.
Well, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, though, is hailed as a reformist. And as you mentioned there, that Ethiopians are looking forward to political and constitutional reforms. There has been criticism, though, from those who believe his efforts have not brought about much tangible change. Is this the case, though? And what are the key areas of concern?
Oh, definite. I think that's usually, I put it this way. The Ethiopia, as a country, we can take it like a vehicle, like a car. The Ethiopian has changed the driver, but they did not change the car. And the car mean the constitution. I think most of the people may not be aware. This constitution of Ethiopia, the current we are on today, it is undemocratic by nature because it's a nation, nationality, and people group. Did not say we, the people of Ethiopia. Everywhere in the world, in most of the country of the world, it say we the people, but in Ethiopia, the constitution is based on the group rights, so that's why they call it nation nationalities. And also that the geography of the regions is not based on the geographical. The regional state is demarked based on the region, on ethnicity. So that really is one of the reasons that the Prime Minister will be facing. So for those people who criticize him, yes, they have the reason to criticize. Most of the things that the Prime Minister accomplished within the country, he did that in the last almost 6 months. That means releasing all political prisoners, appointing the election chairperson and then the Supreme Court. So all of those things, but in the parliament natures or the institution, as I say, that the driver changed, but the vehicle is still there. And so in that case, if you are driving a vehicles, and you change the drivers, and if the brake is not working, doesn't matter who's driving it, it will end up in a ditch. Especially if you are driving in African roads and you have the passenger fighting among each other, which is the biggest problem in the country. I think is an ethnic-based political system in the countries. The political party based on ethnicity, the regional state based on ethnicity. Almost everything has been based on ethnicity. Until you deal with that, until the Prime Minister deal with that, I don't think we will ever be able to get a meaningful reform and also that get the institutional reform and constitutional reform. I think what this country needs, really a stronger institution, but that stronger institution will not come on this constitution that put the group right rather than the individual right, on this constitution that put the ethnicity based on the national identity of the country. So for sure, right, those who criticize him, they have the right to do that, and that's what I mean, yes.
All right, Obang Metho joining us there from Addis Ababa. Thank you for your insights. You're watching Africa Live. It's still ahead on the program. Algeria protests against upcoming elections as 2 former prime ministers are jailed for corruption.
Economic data out of the country.
with a dedicated and diverse team of anchors. CGTN now brings Africa to the palm of your hand.
I'm Penina Karibe in the heart of Nairobi, which is bustling.
From everyday heroes to the continent's most powerful figures, we bring their voices to you.
We haven't changed.
And this is something most of us are very excited about.
We bring you news that's changing perspectives.
I'm Ucheo Paul reporting from Nairobi's city center.
News that brings Africa to the world. CGTN. See the difference. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Algerians go to the polls to vote for their next president in barely 24 hours. More than 24 million citizens are registered to vote. 5 candidates are vying for the top position. They're all mostly former members of deposed President Abdelaziz Bouteflika's government. Abdelmajid Tebboune was a former prime minister, as was Ali Ben Flis. Former Minister of Culture and Tourism are also in the race. Abdelaziz Belaid, who was defeated by Bouteflika in the 2014 presidential election, rounds off the list of candidates. If none of the candidates garner over half of the votes, a runoff will take place. Algeria's powerful army has pushed for Thursday's elections as a way to restore order. Now, while the army is pushing for the presidential poll, Algerians continue to protest against Thursday's election. On Tuesday, thousands of demonstrators took to the streets in the capital to call for the postponement of the presidential election. Protesters are calling for sweeping reforms. After 10 months of demonstrations, protesters say they have not been offered any real choice in the upcoming polls. Protesters forced President Abdelaziz Bouteflika out of office in April.
We're against this election. We're against this farce. We're against the continuation of this regime. They want to impose this vote so they can renew the regime, and we're against this. We want a civil country, not a military ruled one.
We went out on the street to call off these elections because there's no election with this gang. It's a gang all about being fake and stealing. They're stealing our country and our freedom. We don't want them. They must leave.
Now, it's the day before Algeria's presidential elections, but 43 weeks of protests have made it difficult to determine the turnout and the outcome of the poll. Thousands of Algerians began by demonstrating in February against ex-President Abdelaziz Bouteflika's plan to seek a 5th term after a 20-year rule. However, the rallying quickly turned into calls for the complete overhaul of the old guard. CGTN's Daniela Pearson reports.
Algeria's former president, Abdelaziz Bouteflika, resigned after weeks of protests on the 2nd of April. Since February, there was an outcry against his 20-year rule following his aspirations to seek a 5th term in office.
The President of the Republic, Mr. Abdelaziz Bouteflika, officially announces today the decision to end his role as President of the Republic to the Constitutional Council effective today.
The ailing 82-year-old leader stood down shortly after the Army Chief of Staff demanded immediate action to remove him from office. 1 week later, Algeria's parliament appointed Upper House Chair Abdelkader Ben Salah to serve as interim president in accordance with the constitution.
Accordingly, the President of the National Assembly, Mr. Abdelkader Ben Salah, shall serve as head of state for a maximum period of 90 days, pursuant to the provisions of Article 102, Paragraph 6 of the Constitution.
However, protesters rejected this installation while gaining momentum, asking for sweeping democratic reforms, calling on the complete overhaul of the old guard, including all those said to have links to ousted ex-President Bouteflika. An election date set for July 4th failed, officials citing a lack of candidates. This was also amid mass protests demanding the exit of the interim president and prime minister. Hundreds of thousands of protesters continue to rally in Algiers to demand the departure of the ruling elite. Interim President Abdelkader Ben Salah subsequently called for another presidential election in September.
I have decided by the constitutional powers vested in me to announce the date of the presidential election. The election will be held on Thursday, December 12th, 2019.
Hundreds have flocked to the streets of Algiers, rejecting the upcoming election. For the protesters, they say they have not been offered any real choice in the polls. Continued demands for the so-called ruling elite to quit power have not died down days before the poll. Demonstrations have been taking place since February, almost twice a week. The army has said the vote will be fair and an election is the only way to get out of the crisis. And Algerians are waiting to see what the turnout will be. Daniela Pearson, CGTN.
To another election, this time further afield. The 2019 general election in the UK will be held this Thursday, the 12th of December. The polls will open at 7 a.m. and close at 10 p.m. To get a sense of what's happening in the lead up to the vote, I'm joined by our correspondent Phil Lavelle. He's in London for us. Phil, according to a closely watched forecast released on Tuesday, Boris Johnson is likely to win only a modest majority. Tell us more.
Yeah. So this is a new poll that came out, which suggested his majority, his expected majority, has been halved to 28. Now, you've got to take these polls with the proverbial pinch of salt because they get journalists excited and they're what newspaper headlines run on for weeks leading up to the elections. But what we have seen so far throughout this campaign is that the Conservatives have been in the lead. They have been expected to win. What we're seeing now with less than 24 hours to go is that majority seems to be getting squeezed a little bit by Labour. Now, that doesn't mean that Labour are necessarily going to win this election. It still is expected that the Conservatives will win. The question is, by how much? You see, Boris Johnson needs a majority, and that's because he is a man who has staked everything on Brexit. His key phrase this election campaign has been "Get Brexit done." You're going to hear him say it a million times over the next 24 hours. And that's because he called this election to secure a majority so he can get his legislation through Parliament. He's tried before. He's been blocked by Parliament because he doesn't have that big majority he needs because his predecessor, Theresa May, lost it when she believed the polls back in 2017 and called a general election to strengthen the majority. In fact, the country voted the other way. So you've got Boris Johnson on one side, very keen for this majority to get Brexit through. You've got Jeremy Corbyn on the other side, the leader of the Labour Party, very keen to stop him. These men could not be further apart on the political spectrum, one on the right, one on the left, but they are agreeing on two things. The first of all is that this is the most important general election in a generation. And the second is that nobody can guarantee these polls are correct. Boris Johnson is saying to his supporters, do not assume that the Conservative Party, have won this. You must still go out and vote. Jeremy Corbyn is coming from the perspective of saying, look, don't assume the Conservatives have won this. There is still every chance that we can do this. Make sure you go out to vote. We've got both men out on the campaign trail. They've got around just under 21 hours now left to continue campaigning. Obviously, they won't campaign through the night, so they've got the rest of the working day. Boris Johnson travelling across the country. He's been in Yorkshire in the north, then to central England. He's heading west to Wales, back to London, promoting that Brexit key message to his supporters and those people he's trying to entice from the Labour side. Jeremy Corbyn very much concentrating on the National Health Service. That's a big issue in this country. The renationalisation of some industries and also higher taxes for higher earners, what he calls the top 5% of earners. What he says is a more equal, fairer distribution of wealth. One thing that both men are also very keen to watch is the weather. And that is because normally in this country, general elections are held at the beginning of May. It's the start of summer here. It's warmer. It's lighter in the mornings. It's lighter in the evenings. People are more likely to get up, go out and vote. They're in better moods. They're more energised. What we are seeing now is that we are in mid-December. It's 2 weeks before Christmas. The weather is not great. In fact, it's pretty clear today but it's cold. It's expected to rain. People have got lots on their minds because of Christmas. They don't necessarily want to have to go out in the cold, the wet, the dark to cast their votes. So they really are having to make sure that people know how important this is. That said, this is such a polarised country right now because of Brexit. It's so unpredictable. This is an issue that has split families. It's seen people who traditionally would vote for the Conservatives thinking that they might vote Labour. People who would never ever dream of voting for the other side potentially going the other way. So everything still to play for and still 21 hours or so left to go.
Indeed, Phil Lavelle joining us there from London. Now, meanwhile, U.S. House Democrats have unveiled 2 articles of impeachment against President Donald Trump. They accuse him of abusing his powers and trying to obstruct a congressional probe into his dealings with Ukraine. Trump has once again denied the charges. CGTN's Sean Caleb's reports.
No one, not even the president, is above the law.
That, in essence, is the heart of the impeachment case against U.S. President Donald Trump. The formal accusation, abuse of his presidential power and obstruction of Congress. The chairman of the House Judiciary Committee says Trump violated a public trust with the American people.
When he betrays that trust and puts himself before a country, he endangers the Constitution, he endangers our democracy, and he endangers our national security.
Trump lashed out on Twitter, claiming witch hunt. Trump is accused of trying to get the Ukrainian government to meddle in the 2020 presidential election, asking Ukrainian officials to investigate the president's political rival, Joe Biden. And Democrats allege that Trump also withheld nearly $400 million in U.S. military funding from Ukraine's government. Trump countered by labeling the allegations baseless and partisan. In another tweet saying, Nadler just said that I pressured Ukraine to interfere in our 2020 election. Ridiculous, and he knows that is not true. Both the president and the foreign minister of Ukraine said many times that there was no pressure. Nadler and the Dems know this, but refuse to acknowledge. House Democrats say Trump acted with such impunity they had no choice but to bring articles of impeachment against the president. His supporters, however, say Democrats have had it out for Trump since day one, and the impeachment proceedings amount to a coup attempt.
I think the whole thing is a sham. I think it denies the president basic due process. I think it's a threat to the presidency itself.
The next step in the impeachment process could be fast-moving, with a historic House vote scheduled in the coming days. The next step after that would be a trial in the U.S. Senate, with a 2/3 majority needed to remove Trump from office. That is a tall order, considering Trump's Republican Party controls the U.S. Senate. Sean Caleb, CGTN, Washington.
You're watching Africa Live, still ahead on the program. Several mines grind to a halt as South Africa's power crisis worsens. And the African Union reviews its land policy ahead of the Africa Free Trade Area implementation.
Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and global business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
Mines across South Africa are shutting down after flash flooding caused the largest power blackouts in more than a decade. The crisis is threatening a key export sector in a further blow to the country's already slowing economy. Harmony Gold, Impala Platinum and Sibanye Stillwater all said they had been forced to cut production since Monday. Heavy rains across parts of South Africa have submerged whole neighborhoods, leading to mass evacuations and aggravating problems at state-owned utility Eskom. The power utility has been struggling to keep the lights on since 2008. According to the Minerals Council, the mining industry contributed $23.9 billion to the South African economy in 2018, around 7% of gross domestic product. And staying in the sector, Canadian gold miner Barrick Gold has moved closer to its asset sales target. It has agreed to sell its 90% stake in its Massawa project in Senegal to Teranga Gold for up to $430 million. The sale is the largest by Barrick CEO Mark Bristow, who is seeking to shed at least $1.5 billion worth of unprofitable mines by the end of 2020. The decision follows the company's merger with Rand Gold Resources in January 2019. In November, the Canadian miner sold its half of the Kalgoorlie Super Pit gold mine to Australia's Saracen Mineral Holdings for $750 million. Barrick could also look to sell its Tongon mine in Cote d'Ivoire, as well as Lumwana copper project in Zambia. The African Union is reviewing its land reform policy 10 years on from when it was first implemented. The guideline assists member states to adopt proper land management laws and practices at national level, while also protecting rightful land ownership. But often it falls short. The continent is still facing challenges when it comes to land reform, and there are concerns this could hamper the goals of the 2020 African Continental Free Trade Area, whose success is dependent on good land management. Coletta Wanjohi reports.
The intra-Africa trade idea is built on the assumption that the continent will be able to increase cross-border investment that people will use to move their goods and services easily across borders. It also assumes that member states will be able to set up regional production zones, which will help industries grow. But that would require an open-door land policy, which the UN Economic Commission for Africa says is still a long way off.
It so happens that some of the reasons why investment projects that are so essential for within country and across countries trade, why they take so long is because even when you have financing, you cannot actually break the ground because you do not have a right of way, because the land where you want to develop, there are issues allowed around it.
Many countries still lack proper land governance systems to protect land ownership.
There are only 8 countries, for instance, that have done systematic land registration across the continent, and Rwanda is the only one, I believe, that has actually completed the systematic land registration. Ethiopia has also done quite a bit in that regard. So there are definitely countries who are tackling these issues, but we're not quite there as a continent.
There's a lot that South Africa can learn from the rest of the continent in terms of land reform, in terms of law, and in terms of community tenure. Countries like Tanzania, countries like your country, Kenya, countries like Ethiopia, countries like Ghana, Cameroon and Chad. There are different examples of where countries have made strides in fully recognizing the rights of communal tenure.
The African Union says poor land governance has given rise to corruption. The African Development Bank says land developers are targeting countries with what it calls weak governance systems to further their own needs. It is concerned that at the end, it's the public that loses out. Economic experts say the answer to corruption lies in countries embracing digital land registration systems.
We are operating in a digital era whereby it should be possible now for us to digitize all the land records, and also make sure that for each of those land records, we know whether it belongs to the community, whether it belongs to an individual, whether it belongs to the state. We can actually be able to do that.
With the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area set for 2020, Africa hopes to save $35 million that it says it spends annually for importing food. But to achieve this, it will need good land management in order to produce what it needs to feed itself. Coletta Wanjohi, CGTN, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
Well, let's take a look now at a key arbiter of global trade disagreements in crisis. The World Trade Organization's appellate body will be unable to make rulings on dispute appeals made by members as of Wednesday. The body is composed of 7 members and at least 3 are needed to hear an appeal. But after the resignation of 2 judges, only 1 will remain. The U.S. has blocked the appointment of new judges, leading to a halt in operations. The WTO has long been the target of U.S. politicians, including President Donald Trump.
Can we find a solution for the long term? How fast can we do that? What would that solution be? I mean, there are a number of questions there, but it just simply just doesn't mean that it's over. It simply means that, as far as I can tell, it's going to be different.
Well, staying with that story, let's now take a look at how the World Trade Organization got to this crisis.
Trump's disdain for the WTO is no secret. He's even threatened to pull out entirely.
We will leave if we have to.
But it's not just the U.S. president who's unsupportive of the WTO. Blocking appellate judges was a strategy U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer proposed earlier this year, saying it was the only way to reform it. Lighthizer, earlier in his career, even advocated for a panel of retired U.S. federal judges to review WTO decisions and decide if Washington should withdraw as a result. But some in the U.S. are saying being in the WTO has actually helped. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, earlier this year, in response to Washington's rhetorical escalation against the WTO, said it's benefited the entire world, but no one more than the United States. In October, the WTO ruled in favor of the U.S. in a 15-year dispute with the EU. Washington claimed the EU's subsidies for Airbus create an uneven playing ground, harming U.S.-based Boeing. The U.S. was allowed to hit the EU with $7.5 billion worth of tariffs as a result. A study by the Alliance for American Manufacturing found the U.S. winning disputes like these are the norm. It says Washington wins about 90% of the complaints lodged with the WTO. Despite this, the White House looks poised to continue to push back against the organization. Timothy Ulrich, CGTN.
Now, the U.S., Canada and Mexico have signed a historic trade pact after an intense weekend of negotiations. The deal replaces the 25-year-old NAFTA agreement. CGTN's Frank Contreras reports.
Officials from the three signatory nations say the just-signed regional trade agreement, called the USMCA, updates existing enforcement provisions on the environment, labor, pharmaceutical medicines, and it will boost the economies of the United States, Canada, and Mexico.
This trade agreement also strengthens development cooperation and allows us to confront in the best way possible social problems such as migration. We all know that those who abandon their homes and families do not do it for pleasure but for necessity. By guaranteeing growth, jobs, and economic well-being, we deal with the issue in a different way.
The new trade agreement will include a policy of zero tariffs on many products. One major change affects the automobile industry. The accord creates more strict rules of origin as it pertains to the number of parts each vehicle uses that are made in North America. For vehicles assembled in Mexico and Canada, a higher percentage of parts made in North America would give automakers preferential treatment on import duties for such vehicles going to the United States. Negotiations over the auto sector proved to be among the most difficult issues during the agreement's closed-door discussions, according to U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer.
You know that the United States and President Trump viewed the old NAFTA as being a flawed agreement. It clearly was an agreement that needed to be upgraded in very important ways.
News of the creation of this new North American trade pact comes on the same day the U.S. House of Representatives presented 2 articles of impeachment against President Donald Trump.
Prime Minister.
But all sides decided to avoid mentioning the political elephant in the room and instead focused on what these officials say will be the benefits of the trade accord.
All of us together have finally accomplished what we set out to do at the very outset. A win-win-win agreement which will provide stability for workers in all 3 of our countries for many years to come. That is no small thing, especially in today's world.
Compared to NAFTA, some economists say the impact of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement will likely be too small to measure. Mostly, they say, it's a kind of rebranding designed to help boost the waning popularity of President Trump. Frank Contreras, CGTN, Mexico.
Saudi Aramco stock rose sharply as the world's biggest share listing got underway in Riyadh, rising 10% above the initial public offering price. Last week, the oil giant, which produces more than a tenth of global crude supply, raised $25.6 billion. Saudi Arabia's royal family is privatizing assets as part of a plan to move the kingdom away from its reliance on oil.
$1.7 trillion is not exactly a small number, but it's also not the $2 trillion valuation for Saudi Aramco originally envisaged by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman.
I don't think the issue was as a worry about Saudi Arabia or about risk there particularly, because the bond that the Aramco launched a bit earlier was very heavily subscribed and priced very well. I think it was more about the valuation was seen to be high by the international investors, ultimate valuation of 1.7 trillion, and most independent estimates are around the 1.2 trillion range. So I think the international investors just felt that it was pricey, and there is very limited appetite for oil and gas stocks in European and US markets at the moment anyway.
The Aramco IPO began with talk of an international listing and ended with an initial offering of 1.5% on Riyadh's main stock exchange. Roadshows in New York and London were scrapped, and many of those who bought shares were Gulf or domestic Saudi investors.
I think the country itself has got to be a little disappointed about the outcome. 300 than they wanted is not an insignificant amount of money. The issue regarding having no foreign investment, I think certain funds not willing and able to invest, I think is a blow to the international viewpoint of Saudi Aramco. So it's been successful. It was always going to be successful. It was always going to be oversubscribed as the world's most profitable company. But brand awareness for Saudi, I don't think it's been particularly successful.
Ever since it was first teased in 2016, selling a part of the world's most lucrative company has become symbolic of Riyadh's reform agenda, an attempt to wean the economy off a reliance on oil. One of the main objectives of Saudi Aramco's IPO has been to raise money for the government's planned diversification drive dubbed Vision 2030. One of the key questions going forward is how much that lower valuation might impact the kingdom's ability to fund its planned mega projects. After exercising an option to bolster the size of the deal, the IPO is expected to raise $29.4 billion. As for Aramco, it's still overwhelmingly owned by the Saudi state. Analysts speak of a new balancing act to follow state-backed policies such as OPEC plus output cuts, whilst maintaining healthy profits for investors.
In order to do that, they need to do two things. One is, because of the commitments to the OPEC that they have maintained right now, they need to show their adherence to the commitment in terms of the production, and at the same time manage or keep their revenues at a level which would be valued at, say, consider equal to the last year's one, which has been valued at one of the largest profitable industry in the market.
Aramco has entered the history books as the world's biggest IPO. With that crown likely comes added scrutiny. Jacob Greaves, CGTN in Dubai.
And we still have more news for you here on the program. Here's what's ahead. Fancy some edible art. Nigerian artist Hanifa Adam turns food into art and masterpieces.
Join us in Global Business and see Africa through our eyes. The greatest journeys, the greatest sights, the greatest adventures.
Here in Qanater, this weir allows the locals to walk on water.
We're far more than just TV news. We're your passport to the wonders of Africa.
To bring you stories of struggle, survival and hope.
So let's explore. CGTN. See the difference.
One artist in Nigeria is using edible materials like spices and grains to create rather colorful portraits. Here's CGTN's Daniela Pearson with more on that story.
For Nigerian visual artist and blogger Hanifa Adam, it's in ordinary food ingredients that she finds inspiration.
So now I'm going to create a portrait with the Bantu knot hairstyle because I really love the texture and the feel of the hair, and it also celebrates the African culture and heritage.
For this piece, Adam is using finely blended baobab leaves, known locally as kuka. It's commonly used to make soup, but Adam uses the powder to make art. Her artwork is temporary in nature, especially when it comes to perishable items. So after completing a piece, she documents her work through photography. Adam exhibits her work through social media platforms. On Instagram, she has around 30,000 followers.
This is my Instagram page where I document my food art. I also have an arts page which features things that I do as well.
The self-taught artist says her ideas come from daily life, but the execution depends on the material she's working with.
I'm inspired by my personal experiences and observations of the society at large. It's usually introspective.
Vendors at the local market is where the artist stocks up on supplies.
So these are the kind of materials I use to create my artwork. So I'm here to get millet and some other grains that I'm going to be using to create portraits.
3 years ago, Adam started experimenting with spices, grains, and even leftover meals. Her critics say that her work is simply food wastage. But Adam says she works in a very clean environment. Once she is done, she packs up all her grains and spices for home use. And sometimes her art is too delicious to resist.
So now that I've created an artwork on the rice with the sauce, I'm going to dig in now. It's edible art.
Adam does sell her food portraits, but mostly collaborates with brands to create artsy food adverts. Daniela Pearson, CGTN.
And staying in Nigeria, it was a Dog's Day afternoon at the first edition of the Lagos Dog Carnival in Nigeria. Dogs sporting tutus, jackets, masks and sportswear walked the runway along with their owners. Dogs strutted their stuff with popular hits playing in the background, including award-winning song, Who Let the Dogs Out? The event was organized by animal rights activists to promote animal welfare and create awareness on the benefits of owning pets. More than 100 guests and 45 dogs of various breeds attended the show. Awards included Best Dressed Dog, Best Groomed Dog, Best in Showmanship, and the Best Human in Dog Pair. And coming up in your sports news, four-time world champion Noor El Sherbini looking to reclaim the top spot in squash.
How would you create your legend? On the fields, on the tracks, in the arenas of Africa. Were you born to be a player? Could this moment be yours? Sports Scene. Find your game.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
And we begin your sport in North Africa, where the Egyptian dominance in squash has been unchallenged for years. The top of 4 seats in the world in both men and the women's categories have been recently taken by Egyptians. Yet one woman stands out among these iconic athletes. Noor El Shabini. CGTN's Adel Mahroui has more.
At first, 2019 didn't seem a good year for Noor El Shabini. The former world #1 squash player had a serious knee injury which kept her away from the glass box. It was enough to see her drop to the 4th place in the world ranking.
It was very frustrating and bad for me as I was preparing for the new season, and I was almost 2 weeks before going to the first tournament, and then I knew about my injury, so I had to stop for almost 2 months now, and to know what shall I do, or is it safe to keep going and to treat it in this short period or not. So yeah, it was a lot of issues I think I had, but yeah, I'm really glad that I'm here now. I was scared because I wasn't sure what I'm gonna do or how long it's gonna take, and at the same time I need to get back and start competing, and I didn't want to miss these tournaments.
To join the return of the Pyramids Championship was El Sherbini's sole focus. Her comeback from injury was phenomenal. She reached the final against the world's #1 Ranim El Welili, and on her 24th birthday on November 1st, she has won the tournament and her 4th World Championship trophy. Noor was the youngest in the sport's history to win the world title, and still the youngest to get that title 4 times.
There are several titles under your age in general as the youngest world champion. Do you see that this in itself was an achievement? Is it something that you're proud of? And if you achieved that already, what are you planning to do next?
Well, definitely, of course, I'm very proud of what I have did in my life or in my squash career, but always, when you reach something or you reach your goal, you always try to find a high goal or something. So I always put a big goal or a dream to go for, to work for it, and yeah, it's never ending.
Breaking squash records has been her specialty. In 2009, she was just 13 when she lifted the Junior World Championship trophy, the youngest ever. And she made it to the Senior World Top 50 list at 14. She shocked the world when she reached the British Open's final as a 16-year-old. El Sherbini has already achieved what many players do in their 30s. She's expected to break so much more squash records in her career. Adel Mahroui, CGTN, Cairo.
And over to European football.